Well, hello there. My name is Mr. Northrop, and I am so glad you've chosen to take this journey through U.S. history with me from the Civil War to current day. If you're looking for information on the United States from pre-colonization to the Civil War, keep checking back on this channel as I will be uploading new content regularly. Here are just a few things about me before we get started. I'm a high school U.S. history teacher, certificated in multiple states for middle and high grades, and I hold a master's degree in curriculum and instruction. While I have taught many social studies subjects, U.S. history holds a special place in my heart. That's enough about me. Let's get started. I think it's important to note that what you're about to learn in this series is information that is intended to aid students taking the U.S. History EOC assessment in Florida. That doesn't mean it won't benefit students and teachers outside the state. This information can supplement regular classroom instruction for any U.S. history class. Today's lesson is meant to serve as a recap of the events of the antebellum South to the failure of Reconstruction. So antebellum refers to pre-Civil War, where we were seeing this idea that slavery was still prominent in the agricultural heavy states of the South, while the North was becoming more industrial. As the country expanded, the idea of industry versus agriculture quickly became an issue of states' rights as they applied to whether the new additions to the Union would be free states or slave states. As the names would suggest, slave states would allow the practice of owning and trading slaves, while free states would not. There are several aspects of American history that explain the relative balance between states that abolished slavery and those that retained it during much of the time between the ratification of the Constitution and the Civil War. Various compromises allowed new states to enter the Union after the original 13 in order to keep the balance. The maintenance of the balance was tied to the Constitution and how the document organized Congress. While a balance was maintained for much of the antebellum period, the various compromises conceded much to the South. The delicate balance eventually crumbled and led to the Civil War. Let's take a look at how some of these compromises came to be. Compromises were needed to equalize the power between pro-slavery and anti-slavery interests in the government to keep the Union together. One of the well-known early compromises was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was crafted by Henry Clay of Kentucky. This compromise allowed the pattern of one free and one slave state admitted in close proximity to continue, as Maine, then Missouri, would be admitted in 1820 and 1821 respectively. It also provided for all territory south of the southern border of Missouri to be slave states. The next major agreement was the Compromise of 1850, which resulted from the United States acquiring vast territory from Mexico following the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. This compromise held major ramifications for the Union. While the compromise is well known for the birth of the Fugitive Slave Act, the issues surrounding the balance of states is no less important. The major issue was whether slavery would be permitted in the new territories, or if the decision would be left to the people who lived there. In addition, California actually petitioned to enter the Union as a free state, which would upset both the Missouri Compromise line as well as the balance of power, although this issue was resolved via passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring that slaves be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state. The compromise stipulated that Texas would cede lands in dispute in exchange for $10 million, which would cover its debts to Mexico. Furthermore, the territories of Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah were to be organized without mention of slavery, which would allow the inhabitants of the areas to decide for themselves when they applied for statehood. The next major attempt to keep the Union together and maintain the balance of power was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This act repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed for the question of slavery to be determined under popular sovereignty. This idea was similar to the provision for the territories mentioned in the Compromise of 1850 and had tragic results. The act gave birth to violence, bloodshed, and bleeding Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed in the Kansas territory, which was a prelude to the Civil War, over whether or not the territory and eventual state would be free or slave. The attempts to return order to this part of the country resulted in the formation of the Republican Party. Now, this is where things get a little crazy. Southern Democrats wished for slavery to be expanded and reach into western parts of the country. Northern Democrats, on the other hand, argued that this issue should be settled on a local level and through popular referendum. Such democratic infighting eventually led to Abraham Lincoln, a former Illinois congressman and Whig who now belonged to the Republican Party, winning the presidential election of 1860. This This new Republican Party had recently been formed by a group of Whigs, Democrats, and other politicians who had broken free from their respective parties in order to form their own party based on an anti-slavery platform. Abraham Lincoln becoming the popular new face of the anti-slavery movement infuriated the pro-slavery South. Aside from the moral implications of owning a slave for manual labor, the agricultural-heavy southern states depended on the institution of slavery for their economy to even survive. Now, we know that Abraham Lincoln took the office of the presidency in 1861 and would have had a full second term had it not been for his untimely demise at the hands of John Wilkes Booth just after he was reelected. However, while he was popular in the North, many southern states saw his presidency as a threat to their way of life. Shortly after his inauguration, South Carolina chose to secede from the United States. This decision had a ripple effect throughout the South, as many more states saw this as their only option to avoid what they feared was a controlling federal government. As these states broke from the Union, they decided they were stronger together and they joined forces, creating what we know as the Confederate States of America. Wanting to cement their validity, the Confederate States chose Jefferson Davis as their inaugural leader. Abraham Lincoln's initial reaction was to ignore this move for fear of legitimizing it. It wasn't until there was actual blood shed at Fort Sumter that it became apparent that this country was at war with itself. The war lasted for the entirety of Lincoln's presidency from 1861 to 1865. Although the North had a population more than 2 times the size of the South, roughly 21 million compared to 9 million respectively, they still needed to be strategic in their approach to this conflict. Something that was suggested by General Winfield Scott became known as the Anaconda Plan, a strategy that involved neither Sir Mix-a-Lot nor Nicki Minaj. Scott predicted the moves the South would have to take and suggested the Union Army move down the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy into 2 parts. Next, they would block the coastline, eliminating the South's access to the ports necessary for imports and exports. Just like an anaconda, the Union Army would wrap around their prey and squeeze them into submission. Another element of this war and key to victory for the North was the ability of President Lincoln to keep the support of the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Missouri, all of which were slave states. Lincoln was an outward opponent to the spread of slavery in the United States. He was careful to avoid blaming slavery for the war for fear those aforementioned states would switch sides. In fact, while Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation served as a decree to end slavery in the southern states that had seceded, it did no such thing in those border states that had been loyal to the Union. Another important note is that the proclamation itself could not serve as law and was not officially codified into law until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. The turning point of the Civil War was the Battle of Gettysburg in Union territory, where 50,000 troops were injured or killed, and it marked a huge loss for the Confederates. The following day, General Ulysses S. Grant took Vicksburg as well, which solidified the North's dominance with control of the Mississippi River Valley. In November and December of 1864 was a Union-led scorched earth campaign that was meant to cripple the South's war-making capability and wound their psyche. Union orders were to torch buildings that were of military and industrial value in resource-heavy Atlanta. They continued their destruction on what is referred to as Union Major General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea, and moved eastward, ensuring their work was in full view of Southern civilians. This 37-day march devastated the South and freed nearly 25,000 slaves while displaying the unfettered might of the Union war machine. The end of the war was finally in view. Less than 6 months later, General Robert E. Lee would surrender to the Union at Appomattox Courthouse and bring a formal end to the American Civil War. When the Civil War ended, focus shifted to the issues involving Reconstruction of the nation. One important issue was the right to vote. In the late 1860s, Congress passed a series of acts designated to address rights, as well as how the former Confederate states would be governed. These acts included the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and several Reconstruction Acts. The Reconstruction Acts established military rule over Southern states until new governments could be formed. They also limited some former Confederate officials and military officers' right to vote and to run for public office. Meanwhile, the Reconstruction Acts gave former male slaves the right to vote and hold public office. Congress also passed amendments to the Constitution. We already discussed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery as decreed in the Emancipation Proclamation. Kind of. The 14th Amendment made African Americans citizens and protected them from discriminatory state laws. Southern states were required to ratify the 14th Amendment before being readmitted to the Union. The 15th Amendment guaranteed African American men the right to vote. Now, we can all agree that these changes in policy were as good as they were necessary, but there were still those in the aftermath of the Civil War who were none too pleased with the new course for the country. In an effort to throw a wrench into the progressive machine, an actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth shot and killed President Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865. Radical Republicans were shocked by Lincoln's sudden death, but believed his successor, Andrew Johnson, would be more willing to punish the South for the atrocities of the war rather than focus on reuniting the country. However, he pulled the rug from underneath this belief by handing out pardons and allowing the guilty to skirt responsibility. He also openly opposed the 14th Amendment, and although he had supported an end to slavery prior to his presidency, he was a white supremacist. In 1866, he wrote, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." In the end, the radical Republicans won control over Reconstruction, and Johnson became a pariah. Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Bill, but Congress overrode that veto. Somehow Johnson survived an impeachment trial and was later awarded his old Senate seat from Tennessee before suffering a life-ending stroke. Johnson's beliefs had an unfortunate effect on the South as they paved the way for the Black Codes. Mississippi was the first state to legislate a new Black Code after the war, beginning with an act to confer civil rights on freedmen. This law allowed blacks to rent land only within cities, effectively preventing them from earning money through independent farming. This was only the beginning. Codes in South Carolina stated interracial marriage shall be illegal and void, while others forced freedmen into labor contracts with wording that included the words servants and masters. The Mississippi and South Carolina Black Codes never went into effect, as the Union military governors and the Freedmen's Bureau immediately declared them invalid. However, in such an agricultural-heavy region of the country, what did occur wasn't much better, as many of the former slaves in the South were forced back into work with former slave owners, this time as a sharecropper or tenant farmer. The idea of sharecropping and tenant farming almost definitely kept these former slaves in debt to the landowners, and the introduction of debt peonage made sure that they could not leave that job until their debt accrued was paid off. It was a time for great change, and for many it was a time for exploitation. Unscrupulous Northerners headed south looking to exploit opportunities for financial gain and personal power. They were referred to as carpetbaggers. Conversely, scalawags were native to the South. The scalawags turned on their own kind and were deemed as traitors to the South, cooperating with the Republicans for the same reasons as the carpetbaggers: to get rich by exploiting Southerners or gaining power through political advancement. Reconstruction was a grand idea, but it did not last long. By 1877, it was dead. Many factors had helped kill Reconstruction, including economic troubles in the country, a more conservative consensus within the nation, a general feeling in the country that Reconstruction had failed, the resurgence of the Democratic Party, and a growing respectability for racist attitudes. The post-Reconstruction period in the South, which witnessed the rise of the Jim Crow system, marked a time when American race relations are thought to have reached their nadir, with many whites in power pursuing efforts to reassert control over non-whites on every front, from disenfranchisement to school segregation. In 1890, Mississippi became the first state to effectively disenfranchise African Americans using a literacy test and a poll tax. Other legal methods used in the South were the grandfather clause, meaning you cannot vote unless your grandfather did, and the white primary, which was a primary election open only to white voters. Before we finish this lesson, I want to point out a few things. It's important to remember exactly why we take the time to learn about these parts of our country's history, whether they're good, bad, or ugly. Now, as a society, we have made a ton of progress in reference to the acceptance of individual rights and how those rights are applied in different situations. But comfort is the enemy of progress, and we must do everything we can to shine a light on even the worst parts of history to ensure they are not repeated. Ever. That's going to do it for me in this inaugural episode of TLDR US History. We'll see you next time.